Pate, you watching football?
I'm watching DirecTV NFL Sunday Ticket's new Fantasy Zone channel. It's a whole channel dedicated to nothing but fantasy. It's awesome. It's like a fantasy football.
Fantasy, football, fantasy, football, fantasy. If you like football and you like fantasy, fantasy, football, fantasy.
Hey! Yeah!
Back at 'em.
Yeah! There's a fantasy channel that you've gotta see.
It's like a fantasy, football fantasy.
Like catching a football that came from me.
Then opening it up, look, there's Nacho Cheese. Fantasy, football fantasy, football fantasy.
Like an end zone that ends in a waterfall.
A shower that showers you in tiny footballs.
It's a football fantasy like no other.
Like having a best friend that's your quarterback brother. Fantasy, football fantasy, football fantasy. If you like football and you like fantasy, fantasy, football fantasy.
You get constant updates.
I constantly lift weights.
You keep track of your players.
I keep putting on layers.
You watch your points rack up.
I make this car back up. This fantasy channel, man, is so brand new.
It's the greatest thing that ever happened to you.
Like Chris Johnson giving you a Johnson Dew,
While Broadway Joe and your mom make stew.
Sometimes I have this fantasy. I'm on a horse so wild and free. Then the horse grows wings and we fly up into space. But then the music drops out, 'cause there's no sound in space. But my dad's in space, 'cause it's my fantasy, football fantasy, football fantasy. It's like football sandwiched in fantasy. All this talk is saying to making me hungry.
fantasy.